Hey there, welcome back to another quiet evening together. Tonight, let's take a walk through a gate that time nearly forgot. It stands just where it always did, rust dusting its hinges, its latch cool beneath a curious hand. The kind of gate that doesn't need keys, only memories. Agnes hadn't seen it in decades. Yet the moment she stood before it again, everything returned. The house behind it had changed. Sure, new curtains, a different car in the drive. But the gate? The gate still creaked the same. Still moved with that long, low sigh, like it remembered the weight of every summer it had once held open. She paused there, fingers on the latch. Her hair was silver now, her steps slower, but her heart beat the same way it had at 17. That familiar flutter, not from nerves or fear, but from recognition, from a quiet knowing. She pushed it open, and there, through the overgrown grass and forgotten flower beds, stood the old oak tree, the one where Daniel had carved their initials. A crooked heart, 2 letters, A and D, still visible, still whispering. She smiled, soft and slow. Not the smile of someone remembering what they'd lost. The smile of someone grateful for what had once been. Every step she took through the garden sent a memory rising. The crunch of gravel, the scent of lavender in the breeze, the way the sunlight still dappled through the branches in the same old rhythm. She could almost hear him laughing just beyond the bend. Almost. She stepped through. The gate closed behind her with that same familiar groan. And for a moment, it was as if the years folded back, as if nothing had changed at all. Before we begin, if these stories bring you peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me what place do you still return to in your heart. Now, settle in. Let the creak of the gate, the hush of memory, and the rhythm of this evening carry you gently home to the place where love once lived and never truly left. The gate had always been a little tricky. You had to lift it slightly as you pushed, otherwise it would catch on the uneven earth below. It wasn't broken, just aged, like so many things from childhood that needed understanding more than repair. As Agnes stepped through, she instinctively adjusted her hand. Even after all these years, her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. It moved with ease, with tenderness, as if saying hello to an old friend. The garden was wild now, untamed, but not neglected. It had simply grown without a name to call it. Weeds curled through the flower beds like they belonged there. Vines hugged the fence. Ferns had taken root between the flagstones of the old path. But in that overgrowth, Agnes found something beautiful, life, unfiltered, the kind of beauty that only time could make. She paused at the foot of the tree. The one. The oak that had grown tall and proud beside her, year after year. Its trunk was broader now, bark split in deep lines like laugh wrinkles on a familiar face. There it was, the carving, faded but unmistakable. A+D. It took her breath for a moment, not because it surprised her, but because it hadn't faded like she expected. Even time had shown it mercy. She reached out and traced the heart with one finger. The edges were softer now, worn by wind and rain and the passage of seasons. But it was there, still holding them. Her knees creaked as she lowered herself onto the grass. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long fingers of gold across her lap. The same golden light from those long ago days when her whole world was this garden, that boy, this gate. She closed her eyes and listened. The birds, the soft hum of bees. The wind is slipping through the leaves. Beneath it all, a silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of what once was. Full of Daniel's laugh echoing from just beyond the vines. Full of whispered secrets traded over lemonade and the rustle of leaves. Full of that moment so many years agoen, he took her hand and didn't let go. The scent of honeysuckle still clung to the air, faint but familiar. It mingled with the earthy breath of soil and the gentle perfume of old roses gone wild. She remembered how he used to tuck blossoms behind her ear. Never said anything, just smiled at how she looked, with something living nestled beside her face. She reached down and plucked a clover. She smiled. "Still here," she whispered. Everything in this garden spoke to her, not in words, but in sensation. The soft give of moss underfoot, the way the tree's roots curled up from the ground like old fingers. Even the air carried something secreto weightless hush that made room for remembering. The gate, still ajar, swayed slightly behind her, moving just enough to remind her she had passed through. Just enough to say, "You're home." She stayed there, sitting quietly in the dappled light, letting it all return, the rhythm of the past. The way love once felt when it was just beginning, unsure, unspoken, but undeniable. And in that quiet, the past didn't feel gone. It felt near. Before the garden became a place of memory, it was a living world. A place where time didn't tick, it wandered. Agnes was 7 when they moved in. Her hair was still tangled from the long car ride, her shoes too stiff, the scent of cardboard boxes still clinging to her clothes. The first time she opened the garden gate, it was Daniel who saw her. He was already there, crouched by the fence, poking at something with a stick. He looked up, eyes squinting in the sun, and gave a nod, not a wave, not a hello, just a nod, like a boy who already understood that some connections don't need introductions. The next morning, a marble rolled through a gap in the fence. Shiny, blue, almost glowing in the light. She picked it up, looked through the slats, but he was gone. The next day, a dandelion crown. Then, a paper boat with her name folded in its sail. It was a courtship in artifacts. Small gifts from a boy who didn't know what words to say, but knew how to say, "I see you," in a way only children can. By the end of that week, the fence between them no longer mattered. They climbed it, crawled under it, finally cut a loose board to make their own door. No one ever fixed it. Summer after summer, the garden became theirs. They played tag, built forts, invented kingdoms with rulers and rules and wars settled by rock, paper, scissors. They caught frogs and named them after their favorite characters, buried time capsules, and fell asleep on blankets spread beneath the stars. It was a childhood stitched together in sunlight and laughter. There was a summer when the rain never seemed to stop. The kind that drizzled, misted, poured sometimes, all in a single afternoon. Their games moved to the porch, where they played cards, read aloud from old library books, and built a tent of blankets strung between beams and lawn chairs. Inside that tent, they created a world of whispers. He told her stories about treasure hunters and sky pirates. She imagined castles that floated in the clouds and horses that could talk. There, in the hush between thunderclaps, they dreamed like only children could, without limits, without needing reasons. When the sun finally returned, the garden sparkled. Leaves glistened. Puddles became mirrors. Daniel dared her to jump from one stone to another, and when she slipped, he caught her hand, steadying her with a look more serious than his usual grin. For the first time, something unspoken passed between them, something they didn't have the words for yet. One summer, they tried to grow strawberries. They read books on gardening, marked rows with sticks, and watered the dirt religiously. The plants barely grew. The few berries they harvested were tiny, tart, and perfect. They ate them like jewels, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, faces sticky and smiling. There were other moments too, quieter ones, like the day her cat disappeared and she sat under the tree and cried. Daniel didn't say anything, just brought her a glass of lemonade, sat down beside her, and stayed. Hours passed. They didn't move, didn't speak, and still, somehow, it made her feel less alone. And then there was the year she turned 11. Daniel gave her a wooden box with a carved lid. Inside, a pressed violet, a feather, and a note that simply said, "For what matters." She didn't fully understand what it meant then, but she kept it. She always kept it. They had a ritual for the first day of every summer, breakfast under the oak tree. It didn't matter if the grass was damp or if they were still in pajamas. Agnes would sneak toast and jam from the kitchen. Daniel brought juice in mismatched cups. They sat cross-legged, pretending the tree was their cafe and the wind their waiter. They called it the Garden Club. Membership, too. They created maps of the yard, naming each bush and flower bed like cities in their private country. The rose arbor was Blush Hollow. The patch of clover? Luck Lane. The shaded bench became the thinker's seat, where they made rules that no one else followed but them. Sometimes they pretended they were old 70, 80, 90, imagining what they would remember most. "I'll remember this tree," Daniel would say, "and your jam, and your hair when it gets tangled in the wind." Agnes would laugh. "I'll remember your terrible jokes." They made time feel endless. But even then, in quiet corners, there was a tenderness they didn't quite name. A look held a second too long, a hesitation before a hand touched another. The garden bore witness to it all growing up side by side, season after season, until childhood slowly gave way to something quieter, deeper. And then came the summer he didn't joke as much. When he started talking about books with harder words, about places beyond the garden gate, about time ticking forward. She didn't say it out loud, but she felt ithou the garden seemed smaller. Not because it had changed, but because they had. Still, in every corner, there were memories like petals fragile but vibrant. The taste of lemonade was too sweet. The scratch of the swing rope in her palms. The sound of his voice calling her name as the fireflies blinked their way into the night. They didn't know then that they were creating something they'd never quite let go of. But that's what childhood does. It builds forever in the shape of now. The day they carved the tree was warm, the kind of warmth that sinks into your skin and stays. It was late summer, the end of the longest break of their lives. They didn't know it, of course, but something in the air felt like a closing curtain. They'd spent the afternoon gathering fallen leaves, tracing them onto paper, calling it Nature's Diary. Daniel had brought his pocket knife, not a sharp one, but the kind a boy might carry to feel older. He used it to strip bark from fallen twigs, to cut apples, to press into soft wood. Agnes watched him carve the outline of a leaf into a plank of bark, silent and focused. "You're good at that," she said, sitting beside him with her skirt pulled over her knees. He shrugged. "It's just lines." She tilted her head. "But you're good at choosing where they go." He glanced at the tree beside them. The oak. Their oak. Without a word, he stood, walked to it, and ran his fingers along the bark. Agnes followed, curious. Then he began to carve. Not quickly, not with flair, slowly, carefully, as if each motion meant something. A plus D, a crooked heart around it. She stared. Her breath caught not in surprise, but in recognition. It was the first time anything between them had been named. Not with words, not out loud, but carved, made real, made lasting. She didn't say anything, but when he looked at her, he didn't need her to. The silence between them said enough. They didn't talk about the carving the next day, or the day after that, but Agnes noticed things. Daniel sat a little closer. He waited just a bit longer before walking home. When he laughed, it landed differently, softer, like a secret only she understood. And when she stood beneath the tree alone, she'd look up at the heart and smile. It didn't mark a beginning or an end. It just existed, like their bond had all along. That fall, they started writing notes to each other, folded inside hollowed acorns or tucked between the slats of the garden fence. They weren't love letters. Not really. Just things like, "The moon looked nice last night," or "I read a line in a book that made me think of you." Still, Agnes kept everyone. One chilly afternoon, Daniel brought her a scarf. "My mom made it too long," he said, "so now it's yours." She wore it all winter. Even years later, long after the threads wore thin, she kept it in a drawer lined with lavender. They shared fewer games and more thoughts. Saturday longer in silence. Read harder books. Began to realize they didn't need to speak every feeling out loud to understand each other. One evening, the wind picked up while they sat beneath the tree. Leaves danced in the golden air, the kind of light that made everything feel like a memory in real time. Agnes turned toward Daniel and asked, "What do you think happens to things like this?" He looked at her. "Like what?" "This," she said, waving gently at the tree, the carving, the fading day. "Us." He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "I think they stay." The carving became more than just a symbol. It was a placier, small, quiet center of their universe. When things felt uncertain, they would meet beneath it. When words were too hard to find, they'd lean their backs against the trunk and let the silence speak for them. That winter, Agnes got sick. Nothing serious, just the flu. But for 2 whole weeks, the garden stood empty, her room quiet. When she returned, wrapped in 2 scarves and her mother's oversized coat, Daniel didn't say anything. He just held out a book she'd been meaning to read and sat beside her in the frost-covered grass like no time had passed at all. She opened the book later and found a leaf inside a violet maple. On it, in Daniel's cramped handwriting, "Glad you're back." She pressed it between pages and never removed it. In early spring, they found a robin's nest in the crook of a branch just above the carving. 3 eggs, tiny and blue. They checked every day, whispered so as not to scare the mother, and watched as the hatchlings broke free. They named each bird, argued over which was the bravest, and held their breath the day the first one flew. When it did, Daniel leaned toward Agnes and whispered, "It's like magic, but real." It was the first time he'd looked at her that way soft, wide-eyed and completely still. Agnes felt it in her chest. That quiet blooming. But still, they said nothing. Not yet. Late that summer, Agnes brought a notebook to the garden. "For our story," she said. Daniel grinned and opened it to the first page. They started writing not the story of how they met, but the story they wanted to live. A garden that grew wild but listened. A girl who talked to birds. A boy who spoke in poems. It was beautiful. And silly. And entirely theirs. They wrote for weeks, page after page. And when they finished the last one, they placed the notebook in a tin box and buried it beneath the tree, right beneath their carved heart. "We'll read it again someday," Agnes said, and Daniel nodded. Together. The change came not with a storm, but with a sentence. "My dad got a new job," Daniel said one afternoon, staring out at the garden instead of at her. "We're moving." Agnes froze, her hands still dirty from pulling weeds. "Where?" "Far," he said. "West Coast." That was all. He didn't say it like he wanted to leave. He said it like he didn't have a choice. She nodded. Because what else was there to do? And for a while, life went on. They still met in the garden, still sat beneath the oak. But something had shifted. The air between them grew heavier, the silences less comfortable, more questioning. Every laugh felt a little too bright, like it was trying to cover something. The days began to feel numbered, even though no one was counting. One afternoon, she found him carving again, just small lines into the bark near the base of the tree. When she sat beside him, he stopped, handed her the knife, and said, "You do the next one." She hesitated, then carved a tiny leaf. Side by side, their marks grew. As the weeks passed, they avoided the subject more than they discussed it. Agnes began counting things instead. How many times did he knock at the gate? How many books did they share? How many times had she caught him staring at her before quickly looking away? She marked her own calendar in secret X's leading up to the end of August. And though she never said it aloud, every day felt like a page turning too fast in a book she wasn't ready to finish. Daniel was quieter now, thoughtful. He lingered more when they said goodbye in the evenings, and his hands fidgeted when they sat beneath the tree. One evening, as the sky turned a dusky lavender, she found a note tucked into the carved heart on the tree. It simply said, "I don't know how to say it." She didn't respond with words. Instead, the next morning, she brought a second notebook, the twin to the one they'd buried. She handed it to him without explanation, and he smiled. They didn't fill it this time. They only wrote one page each. He wrote first, then handed it to her. And she, with her heart steady, wrote last. They didn't say goodbye. When the day came, Daniel didn't come to the door. Instead, he left the second notebook under the tree beside a stone. Inside, her page still smelled faintly of lavender and ink. Agnes waited a long time that morning, listened for the gate, for footsteps, for anything, but nothing came. Later that afternoon, she walked to the tree. The garden was warm, full, and humming with late summer life. She picked up the notebook and opened it to the page he'd written. It read, "I tried to tell you in every story. I carved it in the tree, in the way I waited at the gate, in every note, every silence. You were my favorite chapter. I hope one day we finish it." She closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest. Then she sat on the grass, alone, and let the garden hold her one last time. She didn't cry, not then. There was no heartbreak, just fullness. The kind that comes from knowing you are part of something beautiful. And when she finally stood, the wind passed through the garden, and the gate creaked once more, soft and slow, like a promise never broken. Time, when it moves slowly, is hard to notice. It's only when we look back that we see how far we've come. Agnes lived a quiet, full life. She became a librarian, just like she dreamed. She read more books than she could count. She traveled a little, laughed a lot, and filled her days with gentle routines and small joys. A good life. But some names never quite leave us. Daniel's never did. She didn't talk about him often, not because it hurt, but because it didn't have to be spoken to be real. His name was a whisper that lived between chapters. Between the steam of her morning tea and the hush of late evening walks. Between the rustle of leaves in her garden and the creak of her own backyard gate. She kept the notebooks. The first, buried under the oak, remained untouched. But the second? She kept it close. Sometimes she read it on rainy afternoons. Sometimes she just held it, remembering the weight of possibility. She never searched for him, never wrote, never asked after where he'd gone. Not because she didn't care, but because some stories aren't meant to be picked apart. They're meant to be held gently, like snowflakes. Beautiful because they're fleeting. When she thought of him, it was always with warmth, not longing. Just a quiet comfort, like the smell of old books or the feel of worn slippers. Years passed. She moved once, then again. But she always planted a garden, always chose a house with a gate, always kept a spot for violets and lavender. And then, one late spring, something changed. She was older now, slower. But there was a feeling she couldn't shake a tug. Soft but certain. She took the train back to her childhood town, walked the familiar street, past the school, the corner store, the sidewalk crack where she once scraped her knee. And then there it was, the gate. Still there, still tricky, still hers. She stepped through it like a breath. The latch gave with that same familiar resistance, then surrendered with a sigh. The garden, though overgrown, welcomed her. Wild grass whispered at her ankles. Blooms bent gently in the wind. The air smelled of soil and memory. She walked slowly. Every step stirred something in echo. A laugh, the shadow of a summer long gone. And then she saw it. The tree. Her tree. Their tree. Older. Thicker. Its bark furrowed with age. But the heart was still there. A plus D. Faded, softened, but still visible. Still honest. She pressed her palm to it and closed her eyes. "I never forgot," she whispered. She didn't cry. There was no need. Her tears had been shed in different years, different homes. What filled her now wasn't sadness. It was peace, pure and whole. She sat beneath the tree and opened her bag. Inside the second notebook, she flipped to the page, the one he'd written so many years ago. She traced the ink. She smiled. Then, with slow hands, she turned to the next page and began to write again. Not to him, not to anyone, just to remember, to honor, to finish a chapter, not with an end, but with grace. When the light began to fade, she stood and tucked the notebook into the roots of the tree, just for a while, just to let it rest. Then she walked back to the gate, stopping once to turn and take it all in. And she whispered, "Thank you," not to Daniel, not even to the garden, but to time itself, for giving her this quiet return, this gentle homecoming. Agnes didn't return to the garden again, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. Some places become a part of you, not by staying near, but by staying true. And that garden, that gate, that boy with the paper boat and crooked smile, they were stitched into the very shape of her heart. She lived many more years, found joy in simplicity, in sunlight across the kitchen table, in handwritten letters, in the kindness of strangers, and the comfort of old blankets. But every now and then, when the wind curled just right, or a robin called from a nearby tree, she would pause, smile, and now she had loved well, quietly, honestly, lastingly. She never tried to replace it, didn't need to. What she'd had, what they'd shared, wasn't a chapter that demanded more. It was a complete story, written in gardens and laughter, and all the words that were never spoken but always understood. On her last birthday, she received a card from a neighbor's grandchild. It said, "Thank you for always being kind." Agnes tucked it into the same drawer where she kept the old scarf, the faded clover bracelet, and a pebble from the garden path. She called it her box of beginnings. Sometimes she would open it, not to feel young again, but to feel whole, to remember how deeply one quiet summer could shape an entire life. Because that's what love does. It roots itself in you. And even when time pulls you in other directions into cities and libraries and long afternoons alone, it remains. Gentle, steady, present. She believed love didn't need witnesses to be real, that some of the strongest loves are the ones never spoken aloud, the ones that live in shared silences, in carved tree bark, in a letter never mailed. And so, as she grew older, she spoke less of the past, but carried it more deeply. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, she sat in her chair, a book in her lap, and her eyes on the sky. The clouds had lined up like stepping stones, and in that soft light she whispered, "I remember," not in sadness, but in gratitude. To you listening now, maybe you've loved like that, or maybe you've hoped to, and if not yet, maybe one day you will, because the world turns fast. But love lingers. It waits at old gates, and in forgotten gardens, and inside stories like this one. If this brought you peace tonight, I invite you to like the video, subscribe for more quiet stories, and share in the comments what memory do you hold gently. What love, what moment do you return to in your heart? Now, close your eyes. Feel the hush of the garden, the warmth of an old smile, and sleep well, knowing some stories never end. They simply rest, waiting for us to remember. Good night.